everyone, this is going to be the start of a little mini series of reviews of corset related books that I've read recently, and I'm going to be starting with this one. It's called Corsets, a Modern Guide, written by Velda Lauder. This book is kind of a walk through the history of corsets, and when they start at the beginning, they start at pretty much the very beginning, not the Big Bang or anything, but basically as far back as people can find corset-like objects or garments. So they talk about the ancient statues in Crete, other sculptures, paintings. They talk about Boadicea, the Celtic goddess. I'm not sure if I had pronounced that correctly. Basically, all of these statues and paintings of women that were wearing corset-like garments, often leather wide belts that are laced up, and they were used more as armor for anything else. But basically, the reason that these garments were laced up is that not a lot of other forms of fastenings were known at the time. This was before buttons or zippers or anything were invented, obviously. So that is the reason that a lot of these garments laced up. However, they were still worn quite tightly around the midsection, which was the main idea. The book also touches on humans' need to basically reinvent ourselves. So they talk about other forms of body modification throughout history, like foot binding or neck stretching, and now plastic surgery is quite prevalent. So really, corsets are nothing new. Ms. Lauder also mentions that women's bodies today are not exactly the same as they were in the Victorian era. Obviously, 200 years is not enough time for the human body to really evolve, but for health reasons, for nutrition reasons, what have you, women today are not exactly the same shape and size as they were back then, and so corsets today have to be made differently to accommodate that. It's also important to note that corsets, although they were used for many centuries, they weren't all the same shape. So, for instance, in the 16th century, it was made to flatten the body's curves and give a more childlike appearance. And then corsets were a little bit higher. The empire waist was popular in the Regency, and then during the 19th century, the hourglass figure was very in. But corsets were not the only garment that actually contributed to shape. Obviously, there's a lot of padding on the shoulders, on the hips, also farthingales, crinolines, etc. So it's not only the corset that gives the appearance of a very tiny waist, it's also the contrast of bigger garments above and below. Another purpose for all these undergarments is basically warmth, because remember, a few hundred years ago things were a little draftier, and also to protect their more expensive outer garments from all the sweat and oil and sloughed skin cells from their body, because you have to remember that people did not bathe every day. So this book goes through the medieval, the Renaissance, the Baroque eras, all those different types of fashion eras, and it goes through basically the different iterations of the corset and other undergarments like the farthingale and the crinoline. And it also touches on the differences and the similarities between the more wealthy and the industrial classes. So yes, the more wealthy classes, they did dress more impractically. You know, they were able to cinch tighter than the industrial class. They were able to have wider hoop skirts than the industrial class, because it proved that, you know, they didn't have to work. However, both the wealthy and the industrial class, especially in the 19th century, did wear a corset. There are existing documents, letters, newspaper columns of primarily men, actually, who resist the use of corsets by women. But really, women's fashion persisted because of women, not because of men. So it was really the mothers, the grandmothers, the maids that were encouraging these younger women to wear corsets and to have that sort of, you know, hourglass silhouette that was so fashionable at the time. And although the men complained, it was largely the opinion of the women at the time that the men shouldn't really have any say in the matter. So all those rumors and myths of, you know, men inventing the corset to keep women quiet because they're historical, misogynistic douchebags, that's actually not really true. That's blown out of the water. So just a couple of notes that I found particularly interesting in this book pertaining to certain times in fashion history. During the Baroque era, it was fashionable for a woman to take up 3 times the volume of a man. So they did this in girth, using padding on the shoulders, using the panniers and the padding and the gigantic skirts. And they did this in height by basically wearing high heels and those huge hats and and wigs. And during the 1800s, both men and women did wear corsets, like I had mentioned in my men in corsets video, especially those of higher class, as it helped their clothes fit better, it helped with, you know, good posture, and proved that they were like an outstanding citizen, literally. In this book, it was mentioned that one of the more popular men that sort of famously wore corsets was actually King George IV. Apparently it had a girth of around 50 inches or so, as he was a larger man. There's also a pretty big section in this book that talks about modern corsetry, obviously. So big designers like Thierry Mugler, Jean-Paul Gaultier, Alexander McQueen, and how they made crazy corsets made from plexiglass and metals and feathers and scales and latex and rubber and all these basically new materials that Victorians basically never used, and how they were able to mix, you know, the elegant with the fetish, with the surreal. And this also talks about Christian Dior in the 40s and the 50s being responsible for the new look fashion, and also Chanel and Jacques Vabre. Also in the 70s, there was Vivienne Westwood, the sort of the mother of the punk movement, who was one of the first people, if not the first person, to wear a corset specifically as outerwear. Also, there was the goth movement in the 80s, the Madonna's corsets in the 90s, and now corsets are being reinvented once more in the steampunk movement. This also has a section dedicated to burlesque, so you can read about Gypsy Rose Lee and vaudeville and Betty Page, and obviously more modern burlesque artists like Didi Von Teese and Modesty Blaze, and how corsets had played a huge role. There's also a section on the fetish side of corsets, and how one of the first known documented stories of, you know, sort of corset related fetishes were published in the English Women's Domestic Magazine, and how a lot of those articles are now sort of, you know, if you're not educated and you don't know that it's tongue-in-cheek, a lot of people today will think of it as being true, but really it was fantasy. It's largely dismissed as fantasy now. They also talk about corsets as a form of body modification alongside branding, tattoos, piercings, implants, and all that, and how Fakir Musafar is kind of the father in that area. Also, Mr. Pearl and Galliano both promoting the more couture side of corsetry, heavily embellished pieces with lots of lace and beads and things, and basically making corsets that are wearable pieces of art. Obviously, you know, other designers like Alexander McQueen, you know, their corsets are wearable art as well as just different art. And the last chapter in this book is totally different. It is the Modern Girl's Guide to Corseting. So it's like Corseting 101, how to choose the right size for your body, and how to lace it up yourself, those types of things. It also has interviews from 3 different models that had worked with Velda Lauder and their personal experiences with corseting. Now onto some personal thoughts. I'm no great expert in grammar and syntax, but I found this, you know, it's very readable. There are very few, if any, errors in there, and I found this kept my attention better and was a lot easier to read compared to, say, Corsets and Crinolines by Nora Waugh. That's another book that I had reviewed before. It has a lot of information in it, but if you can't read French, then half of the information is not really usable for you. This was very easy to understand. I did find this book kind of jumped around a bit though, for my specific purposes. So they would focus on one specific thing, for instance, corsets, and then they would talk about that all through history, in the Renaissance, in the Baroque, in the Victorian era, and in modern times. And then they would focus on something else like farthingales or silhouettes or designers, and then talk about those in the Renaissance, in the Baroque, in the Victorian era, in the modern era. So if you want to only read about the history of one specific thing at a time, all through history, then this book is for you. But in my personal preference, I would rather have a different chapter dedicated to each specific era in fashion, and have them talk about everything within that era. When I first purchased this book and I was reading through some of the written reviews, a few people said that it was very Velda-centric. And reading through this, yes, it does touch on some of her experiences, and it does, you know, mention her as pioneering certain styles in the corset industry and in the fashion industry. And many, if not most, of the pictures in this book are actually of Miss Lauder's corsets. So yes, it does have a heavy, velvet feel to it. However, this is supposed to be, her book. This is her journey through corset history, and it's not supposed to read like a textbook. It is not, completely unbiased the way that a textbook really is. It's obviously pro corsets, so I'm not really surprised that, she put a personal edge on this book. And it was actually Bex Paul who had written this really nice passage on page 215. She says, quote, "For me, the corset will remain a positive addition in my life. For others, I hope it allows more women to feel as perfect as they should feel, as desirable as the next, as beautiful as they are, and as strong as they need to be," end quote. And that is basically my sentiments in a nutshell as well. People wear corsets for different reasons, and for different people, a corset represents different things to them. And for those who do wear a corset, I should hope that it has a positive influence in their life. So this concludes my review, which is actually more of a summary / overview of Corsets, A Modern Guide by Velda Lauder. Have you read this book? Let me know in the comments down below. Tell me your favorite parts or your least favorite parts about this book. If you want to see more book reviews in the future, then please click subscribe, as a few of those will be coming up soon. And if you liked this video, then please click that like button below. I will see you all in a few days with the next video. Bye.